A 74-year-old father opened his mailbox to find not an invitation, but a cold rejection and a $190,000 bill from his own son demanding he cover the wedding and honeymoon he was banned from attending. The audacity dripped from every line of that invoice, each dollar sign a slap in the face, each expense a reminder that loyalty and sacrifice meant nothing. Viewers will wonder how any son could humiliate his father this way, and what kind of justice could possibly follow. Subscribe now and share in the comments where you're watching from before the next chapter of betrayal unfolds. James Washington sat in his modest living room with the letter still trembling in his hands. The $190,000 demand burned into his mind like a brand he could never erase. The betrayal clawed at his chest, but beneath the sting another tide began to rise. Memories, raw, vivid, unrelenting, pulled him back through the decades, painting a story far more powerful than a wedding invoice. He could still see Ruth, his late wife, her hair damp with sweat after pulling a double shift at the diner, sliding into the passenger seat of his old Ford pickup with a smile that said everything would be fine. They had nothing but each other and a boy they loved more than their own lives. Every dollar mattered, every choice was survival, and every sacrifice carried the weight of Marcus's future. James had spent nights on construction sites pouring concrete long after the sun dropped behind the trees. His hands blistered, his back bent. Ruth worked at 2 jobs, the diner by day and the hospital cafeteria by night. When Marcus got sick at age 9, it wasn't sleep that kept them awake, it was fear. The hospital bills came like waves, relentless and merciless, but James never faltered. He picked up extra shifts, bartered with suppliers, even sold his father's old hunting rifles just to keep the boy alive. Ruth used to whisper, "We'll get him through this, Jimmy. He'll live the life we never had." And he did. Marcus grew stronger, taller, sharper. By the time high school rolled around, James had calluses so thick on his palms he could grip hot metal without flinching. Every scar, every line etched into his weathered face was proof of the promise he had kept. He remembered the night the acceptance letter from Duke University arrived. Ruth cried at the kitchen table, her tears staining the paper as Marcus laughed in disbelief. James didn't cry. He smiled instead, a smile so tight it almost cracked his jaw, because behind it he knew the weight of the financial mountain he would have to climb. They remortgaged the house, drained every savings account, and Ruth picked up a graveyard shift in addition to her day work. James took on projects no one else wanted, dangerous scaffolding jobs, back-breaking bridge repairs, highway contracts in the bitter cold of January. Each check went straight to tuition books, dorm fees. Marcus never knew about the nights James slept in his truck instead of driving home, saving gas money so he could wire another payment to the university on time. Ruth knew, and she would tuck a blanket over him in the driveway when she found him there, whispering that one day it would all be worth it. And for a while it seemed it was. Marcus graduated in a crisp cap and gown, his name called across the stage, while James sat in the audience, his heart swelling with a pride so fierce it almost drowned out the pain in his knees. Ruth didn't make it. Her health was already faltering then, the illness creeping in. But James clapped until his palms stung because he knew they had given their son everything. Then Ruth was gone, and James buried her beneath the oak tree. She loved the one where she used to sit with Marcus in the summers, telling him stories about stars and the people who came before them. James stood over that grave every Sunday for a year, talking to her in the quiet way only widowers understand. He told her about Marcus's first job at a law firm, about his new apartment in Charlotte, about the girl named Ashley he'd been seeing. He told her he was still working, still keeping the house clean, still holding on. And he told her how proud she would be of Marcus. But now, holding that letter, James realized Ruth had been spared this heartbreak. She never saw the boy they raised turn into a man who would erase his own father from his wedding day and treat him like a checkbook instead of blood. She never saw Marcus stand beside a woman who measured worth in dollar signs and family by appearances. James felt the weight of it like a shovel full of dirt hitting a coffin lid. The bitterness was sharp, but threaded through it was an aching tenderness. He remembered Marcus at 10 years old, standing on a Little League field in an oversized uniform, looking to the bleachers for his father's nod before every pitch. He remembered Ruth braiding his hair on the porch one humid July evening while James lit citronella candles to keep the mosquitoes at bay. He remembered Christmas mornings with paper snowflakes taped to the windows and Marcus tearing through wrapping paper with a grin that made every sacrifice worth it. Those memories fought against the present reality, and for a brief moment James wondered if perhaps this was all some cruel test, if Marcus was still that boy somewhere deep inside. But then the invoice flashed in his mind again, itemized lists of crystal glassware, imported orchids, and a honeymoon villa in the Caribbean. Not a note of gratitude, not even a phone call to explain, just numbers and demands cold and absolute. James leaned back in his chair, the springs creaking beneath his weight, and stared at the faded photograph of Ruth on the mantel. She was smiling, her eyes crinkled with laughter, holding Marcus at age 3 in her lap. "I kept my promise." "Ruth," he whispered, "but he's forgotten all of it." The silence in the house pressed against him heavy and unrelenting. For the first time since her death, he wished Ruth could speak back, could tell him what to do, could steady his hand as he faced this new kind of grief. But she was gone, and the only voice he had was his own. He set the letter down and pressed his calloused palms flat against the table, feeling the old wood beneath his skin. The same table where he and Ruth had balanced checkbooks, spread homework sheets, and shared Sunday meals. That table had seen the struggle, the victories, the laughter, the tears. It had carried them through storms. And now it carried him alone, staring at the bill that tried to reduce a lifetime of love and sacrifice to a dollar amount. James's eyes narrowed. The pain was real, the betrayal sharp, but somewhere beneath it another current stirred. It was colder, steadier, the part of him forged in years of labor and quiet endurance. Marcus might think he held the power, Ashley might think she could erase the past, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Because James Washington had built an empire out of nothing but grit and determination, and if he could survive poverty, illness, and loss, then he could survive this insult too. The letter was not an end. It was a spark. And as James sat in that dim room with the weight of history pressing against him, he knew this story was only beginning. The next chapter would not be written in tears or pleas for respect. It would be written in silent strategy and a kind of justice they would never see coming. Ashley Richardson had the kind of presence that filled a room before she spoke a word. Born into money that stretched back generations in Charlotte, she moved with a confidence that wasn't earned but inherited, the kind that came from never worrying about rent or bills, never knowing the weight of an empty fridge. Her family's world revolved around luncheons at country clubs, wine tastings in Napa, and weekends spent at coastal villas. Marcus was her latest project, a man she intended to sculpt into something worthy of her social circle, whether he realized it or not. From the start, James sensed her disdain. It wasn't in what she said, but in what she didn't. Ashley never asked about his work, never acknowledged the calluses on his hands or the decades of grit that had built Marcus's education. At dinners, her eyes would glide past him as if he were furniture, and when she did address him, her voice carried that measured politeness reserved for waitstaff. James knew the type, people who measured others not by character, but by what they could display on paper and parade in public. Ashley's influence over Marcus became clear in subtle shifts. The boy who once wore secondhand jackets and drove an old Honda suddenly became obsessed with tailored suits, imported watches, and dinner reservations that cost more than James's weekly grocery bill. Conversations with his father grew shorter, punctuated by Marcus glancing at his phone whenever Ashley texted. And when Ashley's family entered the picture, the gulf widened. They spoke in coded language, stock portfolios, charitable boards, equestrian events, conversations designed to remind outsiders they didn't belong. Marcus laughed along, trying to keep pace, desperate to prove he could swim in their waters. James had seen men swallowed whole by the need for acceptance. On construction sites, he'd watched younger workers spend paychecks on trucks they couldn't afford just to look the part. But this was worse. This was his son, reshaped, polished, until he no longer resembled the boy James had raised. Ashley praised Marcus when he distanced himself from his roots. She pushed him to sell the old pickup James had given him, dismissing it as embarrassing. She convinced him to move out of his modest apartment into a condo with rent so high it made James's stomach twist. And when Marcus hesitated about costs, Ashley reminded him, "Appearances are investments. If you want to sit at the table, you have to look like you belong." The final cut came one evening at a family gathering. James had been invited out of obligation, seated at the far end of a long mahogany table in Ashley's parents' dining room. The chandeliers glittered above and the air reeked of expensive wine and entitlement. Ashley's father, Gregory Richardson, leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass as he studied James with a faint smirk. "So Marcus tells me you're still working at your age." The table chuckled lightly, even Ashley. Marcus said nothing. James answered calmly, "Work keeps a man honest." But inside he felt the blade sink deeper. His son had let the insult hang in the air, choosing silence over loyalty. It became a pattern. When Ashley's friends visited, Marcus downplayed his upbringing, glossing over the sacrifices, erasing the nights James and Ruth had fought to keep him alive. He told stories that made him sound self-made, carefully omitting the foundation his parents had built. James sat in silence, his jaw tight, his hands folded, watching his son reinvent himself to fit into Ashley's glossy world. It was like watching a house he had built brick by brick be painted over until the structure was unrecognizable. Ashley thrived on control, and Marcus handed it to her piece by piece. She chose his clothes, his restaurants, even his words. When James confronted him once, Marcus brushed it off. "Dad, this is just the way things work now. You don't understand how important networking is." James stared at him, seeing not a man, but a puppet with silk strings. He wanted to shake him to remind him of who he was before Ashley's shadow consumed him, but the words died on his tongue. The boy who once looked up at him with trust now looked down at him with embarrassment. Resentment brewed quietly in James's chest, hot and suffocating. Every holiday dinner, every polite smile from Ashley that carried hidden judgment. Every moment Marcus nodded along as his fiancée implied his father didn't belong. It stacked like bricks in a wall of alienation. James could feel himself being pushed to the edges, out of the picture of his own son's life. And the cruelest part was that Marcus seemed blind to it, convinced that shedding his roots was the price of love. Ashley wasn't just changing Marcus. She was rewriting his history. The son who once sat beside James on late-night drives through Carolina backroads now scoffed at the idea of simplicity. The boy who once dreamed of building his own company now dreamed of galas and vacations approved by Ashley's circle. It wasn't love that drove him, it was transformation, a calculated makeover designed to sever the past and craft a future that glittered but rang hollow. James knew he couldn't fight Ashley in her own arena. Money, influence, image, those were her weapons, and she wielded them with surgical precision. But he also knew something Ashley had forgotten: real strength isn't built on appearances. It's built on endurance, sacrifice, and the kind of grit that can't be bought. Watching his son slip further into her orbit was like watching a storm gather on the horizon. And storms, James knew, always revealed who had the strongest foundation. As the memory of Ruth's sacrifices echoed in his mind, James felt the weight of her absence sharper than ever. She would have seen through Ashley in an instant, would have warned Marcus with a clarity he no longer seemed willing to hear. James, left alone in his quiet house, understood that if he did not act, Ashley would succeed in erasing him entirely. The boy he raised would become someone else's creation, and the life he and Ruth had fought for would vanish into a haze of champagne and chandeliers. The resentment hardened into something colder, something sharper. James was no stranger to battles, and this was no different. Ashley thought she was steering Marcus toward a brighter future, but James could already see the cracks in the facade. And he knew one thing with absolute certainty: when the moment came, when the pressure built too high and Ashley's carefully constructed world began to crumble, Marcus would have no one left to turn to but the man he had cast aside. And when that day arrived, James would be ready, not with open arms, but with the kind of reckoning they would never forget. James Washington had endured slights before, quiet humiliations tucked behind Ashley's polished smile. But the discovery of the final insult was a wound deeper than all the rest. He found out by accident a slip of paper left on the counter when Marcus stopped by to collect more checks for upcoming expenses. James had watched him leave in a rush, his phone buzzing endlessly with Ashley's reminders. The envelope sat half open, a glimpse of embossed lettering catching the light. James unfolded the guest list, his eyes moving down the neat columns of names past senators, philanthropists, wine magnates from California, and names that belonged more to corporate boardrooms than to family trees. He kept scanning, searching for his own. It wasn't there. Instead, his eyes froze on two names that made his breath hitch. Ashley's yoga instructor listed between a hedge fund director and a cousin from Florida, and her personal shopper slotted neatly into the seating chart like royalty. James blinked once, then again, hoping he'd missed something. But the truth was stark, the ink sharp against the ivory paper. He had been erased. His place in his own son's life had been handed to strangers who bent Ashley's world into the shape she preferred. The humiliation was cold, cutting through him like January wind. He felt his throat tighten, the kind of ache that comes not from rage alone, but from heartbreak laced with disbelief. He could imagine Ruth's voice if she'd been alive to see it, sharp, furious, unwilling to let anyone treat their family like disposable baggage. But Ruth was gone, and James stood alone in the kitchen with the paper trembling in his calloused hands. That evening he confronted Marcus. The boy, now a man, but looking smaller than ever, shifted uneasily when James laid the guest list on the table. Marcus tried to explain, his words slippery and hollow, like excuses rehearsed too many times. "Dad, it's not what it looks like. Ashley and I had to make some decisions. It's complicated." James's voice cut through the air, low and controlled. "Complicated. You replaced your father with a yoga instructor." Marcus flinched. His eyes darted, seeking refuge in explanations that would never come. Finally he muttered, "Ashley wants the wedding to reflect the future, not the past." The words hung there heavy and cruel. The past. That was what James had been reduced to. Not a father, not the man who had built Marcus's entire foundation, but a relic. An image too unfashionable to be included in Ashley's carefully curated stage play of a wedding. James felt the rage boil, but it wasn't loud. It wasn't wild. It was the kind that simmers low, controlled, precise. The kind that has nowhere to go but inward until the time comes to strike outward. He looked at his son, then really looked and saw not the boy he had raised, but a man swallowed whole by someone else's ambition. Marcus's shoulders curved inward, his tie pulled tight, his jaw clenched, his every gesture echoing Ashley's grip on him. Ashley arrived mid-conversation, her perfume sweeping in before her voice. She wore a smile that didn't touch her eyes. When James asked her directly why he wasn't on the guest list, she didn't hesitate. Her answer was smooth, polished, rehearsed. "James, this wedding is about Marcus and me. It has to reflect where we're going, not where we've been. We love you, of course, but some things just don't fit the vision." The word vision landed like a blade. She said it as if his existence, his presence, was clutter that marred her picture-perfect canvas. James stared at her, his silence heavier than any shout. Ashley's gaze didn't falter. She believed she had already won. Marcus remained quiet, his head bowed slightly as if ashamed, but too weak to resist. James gathered the paper, folded it once with slow precision, and slid it back into the envelope. He didn't argue further, didn't beg for space at a table that should have been his by blood. Instead, he let the silence stretch, a silence that unsettled even Ashley's composure for a fleeting second. That night, James walked the length of his home, each room carrying echoes of Ruth of Marcus as a child of the sacrifices carved into every wall. He stopped at the mantel, staring at a faded family photo. Ruth's smile, Marcus's gap-toothed grin, his own younger self proud and unaware of the betrayals the future held. The anger sharpened inside him, but alongside it humiliation sank its claws deep. To be erased, so easily replaced without hesitation, was not something he could let pass. Humiliation has a way of reshaping a man. It strips him bare, then forces him to decide whether he will bend under it or carve it into a weapon. James had no intention of bending. He thought of the mortgage payments he had covered for Marcus years ago, the tuition bills paid in full, the nights of labor spent ensuring his son never went without. He thought of the grave where Ruth lay, the sacrifices buried with her, and the promise he had made to protect their son's future. And now here he stood, excluded, erased, discarded. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the dim kitchen light, and let it burn slow down his throat. His mind wasn't clouded, it was sharpened. He replayed Ashley's words in his head, each one slicing deeper, each one fueling the resolve hardening in his chest. Reflect the future, not the past. If she thought he was the past, she hadn't yet seen what his presence could do to her carefully planned future. James sat down at the table, pulled out a notebook, and began to write. Not frantic, not hurried. Measured strokes of pen against paper. He listed names, dates, accounts. He thought of contacts built over a lifetime in construction. Men and women who owed him favors, who respected him, who had seen him sweat and bleed beside them. He thought of financial levers, legal avenues, quiet moves that could unravel Ashley's vision, thread by thread. The humiliation no longer consumed him. It transformed into something sharper, colder. He wasn't just a father denied his place. He was a man awakened to the truth of who his son had become and who Ashley really was. And as he closed the notebook, the bourbon warming his chest, James knew one thing with absolute certainty. They had tried to erase him. They had mistaken his silence for weakness. But soon they would learn that some men cannot be written out of history. And the story was about to turn in ways neither Ashley nor Marcus could begin to imagine. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, slipped under his front door like an afterthought. Yet it carried the weight of a guillotine. James Washington picked it up heavy with embossed lettering, his name sprawled across the front in Marcus's sharp handwriting. It wasn't a letter, not even a note. It was a packet thick and deliberate. He carried it to the table where he had once helped his son with homework, spread it flat against the wood, and opened it with a knife he had used for decades to cut through rope drywall and every other obstacle life had hurled at him. What slid out wasn't an invitation or an explanation. It was an invoice, itemized, polished, arrogant in its detail. The first line alone made his breath catch. Venue $68,000. A sprawling estate in the Blue Ridge Mountains, booked for a weekend of curated perfection. The kind of place where the air was perfumed with imported roses, where chandeliers cast light on people who had never known sweat or calluses. James's eyes moved down the list. Catering $42,000. Foie gras, caviar, champagne flown in from France. He imagined the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the sheen of luxury bought not with sacrifice but with the careless expectation that someone else would foot the bill. Then came the photography package. Nearly $25,000 for a team that specialized in legacy image curation. James felt bile rise. It wasn't about love, wasn't about vows. It was about images, pictures designed to flood social media feeds, proof of wealth disguised as romance. But it was the honeymoon that twisted the knife deeper. 2 weeks in the Maldives, an overwater villa with private butlers, daily spa treatments, and yacht excursions. Price tag, $38,000. He sat back, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He thought of Ruth, who never once asked for anything extravagant, who had found joy in backyard barbecues and long drives to the coast. She would have laughed at the absurdity of it all. Then cried at the reality that their only son had become someone who measured happiness in dollars and spectacle. And then his eyes froze on the final page. A line bolded, decisive, impossible to misinterpret. Primary financial guarantor, James Washington. His pulse hammered in his temples. He hadn't signed a thing. He hadn't agreed. Yet here it was, his name inked in with the confidence of someone who believed permission wasn't necessary. Marcus had volunteered his father's life savings, his credit, his future, without so much as a conversation. It wasn't just arrogance, it was theft disguised as entitlement. James set the papers down, but his hands didn't leave them. He stared at the columns of numbers, the elegant fonts, the precision of the formatting, and all he could see was betrayal made tangible. He thought of the years spent climbing scaffolds and winter winds, of the cuts that split his skin open, of the backaches that lingered long after the workday ended. Every dollar earned had been a battle, and now those battles had been converted into a bill for a wedding he wasn't even allowed to attend. Shock turned to heat, rising through him like fire under steel. His indignation was raw, but beneath it was something steadier, colder. Determination. Ashley thought she had written him out. Marcus thought he had silenced him, but this invoice was the mistake. It was proof undeniable and damning that they saw him not as family, but as currency, and James had never been a man to be spent. That night he spread the papers across his desk, the same desk where Ruth once balanced checkbooks by lamplight. He read each line until he knew the details by heart. He highlighted amounts, scribbled notes in the margins, cross-checked vendors with names he recognized from years of construction contracts. He saw patterns, connections, opportunities. This wasn't just a bill, it was a blueprint of their greed, and James understood blueprints better than anyone. By midnight, his mind was clear. He remembered conversations overheard at Ashley's family dinner table, names dropped with casual arrogance. Bankers, event planners, lawyers. He knew the kind of people who ran these venues, the men behind the glossy facades. Some of them owed him favors, some of them respected him, and some of them could be swayed with the right reminder of who he was. The humiliation of being erased from the guest list was already burning into resolve, but the arrogance of being signed as guarantor lit something deeper. James had been underestimated his entire life, and it had made him sharper, harder, more patient. He wouldn't storm into their world shouting. He wouldn't beg for dignity at their table. He would move the way he always had, quietly, deliberately, with the precision of a man who knew that the strongest blows were the ones no one saw coming until it was too late. He closed the folder and looked at the mantel again, at Ruth's photograph. Her smile seemed to meet his eyes, steadying him. "They think I'm the past," he murmured. "They're about to learn how wrong they are." James turned off the light and left the papers on the desk, neatly stacked, waiting. In the morning he would make calls one by one, weaving threads Ashley could never see, pulling levers Marcus didn't know existed. Each line of that invoice was a weapon, and he would wield them all. Because if they believed he was just a guarantor, they had no idea what it meant to be the man who built the foundation they now stood on. And soon that foundation would begin to crack. James Washington rose the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. He had not slept much, but there was no haze in his mind. Instead, there was a clarity so sharp it cut through the silence of the house. The invoice still sat on his desk, its elegant lettering now less threatening, more like a map. To Marcus and Ashley, it was a demand. To James it had become something else entirely, a roadmap to their undoing. He brewed his coffee black and strong, sat down at the table, and began making calls. His voice carried the authority of a man who had signed contracts on job sites worth millions, a man who had negotiated steel deliveries in the middle of snowstorms, who had kept deadlines when other men quit. The first vendor answered, cheerful, polite, unaware of the storm that was about to roll through their books. James introduced himself, gave the event details, and asked a single question: who had signed as guarantor? The vendor confirmed the name. His name. James nodded slowly, then cut in, calm and firm. "I never signed. Cancel my liability immediately." One by one he worked through the list. The venue manager stammered when James threatened to bring in lawyers. The catering director bristled until James reminded him of the city codes his company had failed to meet 3 years ago, a detail James had not forgotten. The photography agency tried to stall with charm, But James shut it down with the simple fact without his guarantee there was no money, and no money meant no contract. By midday, the invoice that had once seemed like a mountain of arrogance had been stripped bare, dismantled piece by piece. But James wasn't reckless. He knew Marcus and Ashley would scramble, that Ashley in particular would spin stories to her family and vendors alike. He needed more than cancellations. He needed control. So he opened a new account, one Marcus knew nothing about. Not a joint account, not a trust fund Ashley could sniff out, but a restricted escrow bound tightly under his own name. Into it he funneled the remainder of Ruth's insurance payout and the construction savings he had carefully protected. Every cent was locked down, untouchable, except under terms he dictated. For the first time in months, James felt something shift inside him. He was no longer reacting to betrayal. He was steering it. With each call, each confirmation of cancellation, he felt a strange satisfaction bloom. Not joy, not triumph, something steadier, something Ruth would have recognized. Moral clarity. The simple truth that he had done what was right, what was just. Marcus might have been blind, Ashley might have been manipulative, but James had always lived by a code: never let anyone steal what you earned with your hands. That code was not about to bend, not even for his own son. He drove into town that afternoon, stopping by the small bank where the tellers still called him Mr. Washington with respect. The manager, an old acquaintance from church, processed the escrow with quiet efficiency. James signed the papers, each stroke of the pen stripping another ounce of power from Ashley's manicured fingers. As he walked out, the autumn air hit his face crisp and cool, and he realized his steps felt lighter than they had in weeks. Back at home, he gathered the invoices, contracts, and copies of the cancellations. He organized them in a neat folder, labeled it, and slid it into the drawer beside Ruth's photograph. This wasn't vengeance for its own sake. It was protection of his name, his labor, his integrity. Ruth had taught him that dignity was worth more than money, and now he understood how easily others would try to strip it away if given the chance. The phone rang just before dusk. Marcus. James let it ring twice before answering. His son's voice was tight, urgent, with the kind of strain that came when the ground started to shift under your feet. Dad, I just heard from the venue. They said something about the contract being voided. What's going on? James kept his voice even. What's going on is that you signed my name without asking. That ends now. Silence stretched. Marcus stammered, tried to explain, tried to frame it as a misunderstanding. James cut him off. I'm not your bank, and I'm not her safety net. If Ashley wants chandeliers and imported champagne, she can pay for it with her family's fortune. My money isn't for show. Marcus grew angry, then his voice rising, but James did not flinch. He listened, then ended the call with a finality that told his son this was not a negotiation. When the line went dead, James felt no guilt, only resolve. As the evening settled in, he sat once more at the table, bourbon glass in hand, staring at the papers spread before him. The arrogance of that invoice had been the last straw, but it had also given him the tools he needed. Ashley thought she could erase him. Marcus thought he could exploit him, but James had turned their own weapon into a shield. He wasn't just protecting himself, he was reclaiming the balance they had stolen. The satisfaction that washed over him was quiet, steady, like the hum of machinery running smoothly after a long repair. He had taken control not with anger but with precision. He knew Ashley would rage. Marcus would plead or curse, but none of it mattered now. The contracts were canceled. The funds secured, the power stripped from their hands. James leaned back, his gaze fixed on Ruth's photo. They won't use me, he said softly, almost as if she were there to hear it. The house was silent, but the words carried weight, filling the space like a vow. Outside, the last light of day faded into darkness, but James didn't feel the gloom pressing in. He felt stronger, steadier, armed with knowledge and control. The arrogance of that invoice had tried to bury him under humiliation. Instead, it had awakened something long dormant. And though Ashley and Marcus didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning, because James had not just canceled their contracts. He had set in motion a reckoning that would cut deeper than they ever expected, a reckoning that would prove once and for all that some men cannot be bought, erased, or controlled. Ashley showed up at his house without warning, her heels clicking on the driveway like gunshots announcing a duel. The air was sharp with the scent of early winter, the kind of cold that made breath visible, and James Washington stood in the doorway waiting. His shoulders squared, his gaze steady. She didn't bother with pleasantries. Her coat was cinched tight, her lips painted in the color of someone who always got her way. In her hand was a leather portfolio, no doubt filled with carefully crafted arguments and polished lies. But James had already stripped her of contracts and guarantees, and that meant she had come here with nothing but words. James. She began, her tone warm but hollow like sugar hiding poison. We need to talk about boundaries, about expectations. She walked past him into the living room as if it belonged to her, setting the portfolio on Ruth's old coffee table. Her eyes scanned the room, lingering on the framed photographs, the worn furniture, the quiet evidence of a life built from sacrifice. A faint smirk touched her lips, subtle but sharp enough for James to notice. He closed the door behind her, his movements deliberate, calm. Go ahead, he said, his voice low, even. Say what you came here to say. Ashley clasped her hands in front of her, tilting her head with that air of condescension she had perfected. Marcus and I agree that it's best if you don't attend the wedding. It isn't personal, really. It's about presentation. The aesthetic we're creating is very specific, elegant, modern, forward-looking. We don't want anything distracting from that. You understand, don't you? Her words cut, but James didn't flinch. His jaw tightened, the silence between them heavy. She continued, emboldened by what she thought was weakness. It's not about love or respect, James. It's about image. Guests will expect a certain standard, a certain look. Your presence doesn't fit that image. And frankly, the focus should be on Marcus and me, not on the past. James took a step closer, his shadow stretching across the coffee table. For a long moment he said nothing, letting the weight of her arrogance hang in the air. Then he spoke, his voice like gravel, measured and unshakable. The past is what built him. The past is what paid for every step that led Marcus to you. You see this house, these photos. Every board, every nail, every dollar was earned with sweat. I worked while my wife worked 2 jobs, while my hands bled and my back bent so my son could stand upright in the world. And you, he pointed to her portfolio untouched on the table, you dare to tell me I don't fit the picture. Ashley's smirk faltered for the first time. Her chin lifted higher, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. James, I didn't mean... But he didn't let her finish. No, you meant exactly what you said. You want to erase me. Dress Marcus in suits. Serve wine none of us can pronounce and pretend he came from money. But he didn't. He came from us, from Ruth and me, from a house with patched roofs and second-hand clothes, from nights when I skipped meals so he could eat, from mornings when I carried him through fevers praying he'd live to see another day. That's his foundation. And you can paint over it with gold all you want, but you can't destroy it. Ashley straightened, crossing her arms tightly across her chest armor against his words. Marcus agrees with me. He wants this life. He wants to move forward, not dwell in sentiment. James's laugh was sharp, humorless. Forward. There's no forward without roots. You can't grow a tree in the air. You can try, but it will wither. You're teaching him to cut away the very soil that holds him. That's not love, Ashley. That's control, and it won't last. The fire in his words filled the room, pressing against her curated calm. She glanced at the mantel, at the photograph of Ruth holding a young Marcus, and for the briefest second her composure cracked. It was only a flash, a tightening of the lips, a flicker in the eyes, but James saw it. He knew then that beneath her icy confidence there was fear. Fear that Marcus might remember where he came from. Fear that James's voice still carried weight. Ashley reached for the portfolio, snapping it open, to produce papers she'd clearly prepared, but James raised his hand, stopping her cold. Don't bother. I'm not signing a damn thing. Not another contract, not another check, not another lie. You can cancel me from your guest list, but you can't cancel who I am. And you sure as hell can't cancel what I gave my son." Her lips pressed together, her posture rigid. For the first time since he had met her, James saw that she didn't know what to say. The silence stretched heavy and final. She gathered her papers quickly, slipping them back into the leather case with a snap that echoed like defeat. As she moved toward the door, James followed his presence, towering. Just before she stepped out into the cold, he spoke again, his words deliberate, carved from steel. "Ashley, you think weddings are built on chandeliers and champagne. But marriages, they're built on truth. And when the lights fade and the music stops, the truth is the only thing left. Remember that. Because sooner or later Marcus will." Her face hardened, but her eyes betrayed the blow. Without another word, she left her heels clicking a staccato retreat down the driveway. James closed the door behind her, the echo of the latch final, resolute. The house was quiet again, but not empty. It was filled with the power of a man who had spoken his truth, who had reminded her that dignity couldn't be erased with ink on a guest list. He stood in the silence, steady, unbroken, his heart pounding not with shame, but with strength. Ashley had come to diminish him, to push him further into the shadows. Instead, she had awakened the fire in him, the same fire that had carried him through decades of sacrifice. And James knew as he turned back toward Ruth's photograph that this was only the beginning, because the battle wasn't over, not yet. Ashley thought she had silenced him, but she had only given him more reason to fight. And when the reckoning came, it would shake the ground she walked on. Marcus showed up late one night, unannounced, the headlights of his car cutting through James Washington's driveway like search beams. James had been sitting in the dim glow of a single lamp, the house heavy with silence after Ashley's confrontation. When Marcus knocked, the sound was tentative, almost apologetic. James opened the door to see his son standing there, shoulders hunched, tie loosened, eyes rimmed with the exhaustion of a man trying to live two lives at once. He looked less like the confident attorney Ashley paraded around, and more like the boy James had once carried on his shoulders through county fairs, sticky with cotton candy and laughter. They sat at the kitchen table, the same one that had witnessed decades of family history, from Ruth balancing checkbooks to Marcus scribbling out math homework. Now it bore the weight of something heavier, truth pressing against denial. Marcus stared at the wood grain, unable to meet his father's gaze. Finally, he exhaled. "Dad, I don't know if I can keep up with all of this." His voice cracked low, uncertain. "Ashley's family, her world, it's different. They look at me like I'm just a project. Like I'll never be enough unless I change everything." James leaned back in his chair, his face shadowed, his eyes steady. He didn't rush to fill the silence. He let Marcus's confession hang there raw and trembling until the weight of it demanded response. "You feel ashamed," James said finally, his tone more observation than accusation. Marcus winced but nodded. "I watch the way they move, Dad." Marcus continued, his words spilling now like a dam cracked open. "The dinners, the conversations, the vacations. They've never worried about bills, never worried about whether the car would start or whether there'd be food in the fridge. When they talk about the future, it's with certainty. And when I stand next to them, I feel small, like I'm a fraud trying to pass their test." He rubbed his hands together, restless, ashamed. "Ashley says I have potential, that with her guidance I can belong. But I keep thinking, what if she's right? What if I'm nothing without her?" James's chest tightened, but his face remained composed. The boy he had raised to be proud of his roots was unraveling before him, undone by a hunger for acceptance that could never be satisfied. He leaned forward, his voice low, sharp as steel. "Marcus, listen to me. You are not nothing. You are a man built from sacrifice. Every step you've taken, every degree, every suit you wear, it all came from the foundation your mother and I gave you. Not from them. Not from Ashley. From us. From sweat, from sacrifice, from love. Marcus's eyes flicked up wet with unshed tears, searching for something solid to hold on to. But Dad, they make me feel like that's not enough. James's jaw tightened. He set his hands flat on the table, the veins rising like roads across his skin. That's because you're trying to buy acceptance from people who will never truly accept you. To them, you'll always be the son of a construction worker and a diner waitress. They might dress you up, toast you at their parties, but behind closed doors, you'll always be an outsider. You can empty every account, twist yourself into whatever shape they demand, and it will never be enough. Because it's not about you, it's about control. They want you to forget where you came from, so you'll owe everything to them. Marcus swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing shame, bleeding into confusion. His father's words struck deep, but the hook of Ashley's world still dug in. She loves me, Dad. She believes in me. I don't want to lose her. His voice carried the desperation of a man caught in a storm without shelter. James's eyes softened for the first time that night, but his voice stayed sharp. Love doesn't make you erase yourself, Marcus. Love doesn't measure your worth in dollars or demand you be ashamed of your own father. If you can't be yourself with her, then what you've got isn't love, it's a leash. Marcus's breath caught as if he'd been struck. He looked away toward the window where the night pressed close. His reflection fractured in the glass. He thought of the dinners where Ashley corrected his manners, the times she laughed at his old stories, the way her father spoke over him like a child. He thought of how he had stayed silent, nodding along, believing silence was survival. And now, here in his father's kitchen, he wondered for the first time if survival was worth the cost. The clock ticked loud in the quiet. Marcus shifted his hands, trembling slightly. "You don't understand," he whispered. "Her world, it's intoxicating. The houses, the travel, the respect. People look at her family like they're untouchable. And when I'm with them, I want that. I want to be untouchable." James's voice cut clean through the haze. Respect isn't given because of houses or suits or bank accounts. Respect is earned when a man can look another in the eye and know he's built his life on his own terms. Do you think those people admire her father? They tolerate him because of money. That's not respect, Marcus. That's dependence disguised as admiration. The silence after those words was thick, suffocating. Marcus shifted in his seat, torn between shame and defiance. His father's words dug at him, but Ashley's promises still pulled like gravity. He wanted both worlds, the dignity of his roots and the allure of her empire, but he knew deep down they were incompatible. James stood finally, his height casting a shadow across the table. He walked to the mantel, picked up the photo of Ruth and Marcus as a child, and set it gently on the table in front of his son. "This is who you are," he said quietly, but with a weight that filled the room. "You can paint over it, bury it, pretend it's gone, but this is what raised you. And if you turn your back on it completely one day, you'll look in the mirror and not recognize the man staring back." Marcus stared at the photo, his throat tightening, shame flooding through him like fire. He wanted to argue, to defend Ashley, to insist he could balance both worlds. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he sat in silence, torn between the two lives pulling at him, knowing he could not hold them both forever. And James knew as he watched his son wrestle with the truth that the breaking point was coming. Marcus could not serve two masters. His roots and Ashley's world would eventually collide. And when they did, the cost would be more than money. It would be identity itself. The cracks appeared slowly, at first faint hairline fractures in the polished surface of Ashley's grand design. Marcus noticed them in whispers and glances, in the slight hesitation of a caterer returning his calls, in the clipped tone of a venue manager who once gushed over their event. Ashley brushed it all aside, her smile stretched thin, her reassurances sharp enough to cut through doubt. But beneath the sparkle of her words, the foundation was already crumbling. It began with the venue. A letter arrived one morning, curt and final, stating that, without confirmation of payment from the listed guarantor, the contract was void. The estate in the Blue Ridge Mountains, Her crown jewel, her statement piece was gone. Ashley tried to smooth it over, insisting it was a clerical error, but Marcus saw the panic flash in her eyes, the quick flick of her phone as she dialed number after number, her voice rising, her control unraveling. Next came the caterer. He left a voicemail, his voice flat and firm. "Without payment, we're pulling out. And if I don't see funds by Friday, I'll be contacting my attorney." The message was played on speaker, filling the condo with a cold truth Ashley could no longer hide. Marcus listened in silence, his chest tightening while Ashley's jaw set in fury. She deleted the voicemail before it finished, her fingers trembling, her mask slipping. One by one, the dominoes fell. The photography team canceled, citing breach of contract. The Honeymoon resort sent a final notice threatening to blacklist them. Marcus sat in the middle of it, his world spinning, the illusions Ashley had woven dissolving like mist under harsh light. Every promise, every elegant assurance, every lecture about investments in image disintegrated into demands and threats. That was when the letters from attorneys started arriving. Cold, formal notices of pending legal action, threatening damages, demanding compensation. Marcus sifted through them late at night, his hands shaking, his mind clawing for answers. How had it come to this? How had the dream turned into ruin so quickly? And then, in the dim glow of the kitchen lamp, the truth began to form, not from Ashley's lips, but from the silence between them. Ashley had never intended to pay. From the beginning, her plan had been simple, calculated, merciless. James Washington's name on the contracts wasn't an accident. It was the cornerstone. His reputation, his money, his life's work siphoned quietly into her vision of grandeur. To her, Marcus wasn't a partner. He was a stepping stone, a bridge to wealth she had no right to claim. The realization hit Marcus with the force of a steel beam. The shame he had confessed to his father, the desperation to belong, it had blinded him to the truth. Ashley hadn't been building a life with him. She had been building a throne for herself, using his father's blood as mortar. The devastation was complete. Marcus confronted her one night, his voice raw, his body tense, the stack of legal threats clutched in his hand. "Tell me the truth. Did you ever plan to pay for any of this?" Ashley didn't deny it. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she poured herself a glass of wine, her movements calm, her voice cold. "Of course not. Why would I? Your father has money and he owes you. That's what parents are for." Her words hit harder than the invoices, harder than the cancellations. Marcus stared at her, the woman he thought he loved, and saw her clearly for the first time. She wasn't his partner. She was a predator. Every compliment, every kiss, every promise had been bait. His shame, his desire to belong had been the hook she used to reel him in. The awakening was brutal. He thought of his father's warning, the words spoken with quiet certainty. "You're buying acceptance from people who will never truly accept you." He realized now how right James had been. He remembered the steadiness in his father's voice, the way he had stood like an immovable wall against Ashley's attempts to erase him. And he remembered the sacrifices, the nights of labor, the meals skipped, the years of struggle that had been the real wealth sustaining his life. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. Everything he had clung to, every illusion of grandeur, every lie he had told himself collapsed into dust. The condo felt smaller, the walls closing in, suffocating with the weight of Ashley's contempt. She didn't look at him like a man she loved. She looked at him like a failure, a plan gone wrong. "If you can't even control your father," she said coldly, "then maybe you're not the man I thought you were." Those words sliced deeper than any blade. For a moment, Marcus thought he might collapse under the weight of it all. But somewhere beneath the shame, beneath the devastation, a spark flickered. His father's face came to him, etched with lines of labor and dignity. His father's voice echoed, steady, uncompromising. Marcus realized he stood at a crossroads between a life built on lies and manipulation, or a return to the foundation his parents had laid for him with sacrifice and truth. Ashley didn't notice the shift. She poured another glass of wine, scrolling through her phone, already calculating her next move. But Marcus noticed. The fog had lifted, the illusion shattered. He saw her clearly, saw himself clearly, saw the wreckage of the path he had chosen. And though devastation burned through him, something else began to rise, a clarity that could no longer be ignored. Because the house of cards had fallen, and what lay in the rubble was the undeniable truth. Ashley's empire had never been about love or family. It had been about conquest. And now that conquest was over, leaving Marcus to face not just her betrayal but the reckoning waiting on the other side. Marcus returned to his father's house looking like a man who had walked through fire. His suit was wrinkled, his tie hung loose, and his eyes carried the weight of someone who had watched his entire world collapse in slow motion. He didn't ask to come in, he simply stood at the door breathing heavily as though the threshold itself were a test of courage. James opened it without a word, his gaze steady, his silence louder than any greeting. The son who once thought wealth could define him, now stood on that porch stripped of illusions, shivering not from the cold, but from the rawness of exposure. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same place where truths had been spoken before, where Marcus had once admitted his shame. This time there was no wine glass in Ashley's hand, no portfolio of contracts, no false promises. Only the thick silence between father and son, broken at last by Marcus's trembling voice. "Dad, you were right." His eyes glistened, his jaw tight, as though every word cost him more than he could afford. "She never loved me. She loved what she thought she could take from us." James didn't rush to respond. He let the confession hang, allowed Marcus to feel the full weight of it. Finally he leaned forward, his hands folded, his voice sharp but steady. "Love isn't bought, Marcus. Respect isn't bought. Family isn't bought. You can't dress it up, you can't trade for it, and you sure as hell can't sign it away on a contract. It's earned, it's lived, and it's kept by loyalty." Marcus lowered his head, shame pressing down on him like a stone. "I thought I was building something with her. I thought if I just kept up, if I gave her what she wanted, I'd belong. But I see it now. She was building for herself, and I was just the fool holding the ladder." His voice broke, his hands curling into fists on the table. "And I almost let her erase you, Dad. I almost let her erase Mom." James's eyes softened at the mention of Ruth, but his tone remained firm. "Almost doesn't matter. What matters is what you do now. You've seen the truth. The question is whether you'll stand in it or keep chasing lies." Marcus swallowed hard tears, threatening but restrained. He lifted his gaze, finally meeting his father's eyes with a clarity that had been missing for years. "I want to stand in it. I want to be the man Mom believed I could be, the man you raised me to be. But I don't know where to start." James reached across the table, his weathered hand covering his son's trembling one. "You start by owning your mistakes. You start by standing on your own 2 feet, not on the shoulders of someone who despises where you came from. You lost money, Marcus. You lost pride. But you haven't lost yourself, not yet. You can still choose who you're going to be." The words struck deep, cutting through the haze of regret. Marcus felt something shift inside him, not the desperate need to prove himself, but the slow, painful birth of integrity. It wouldn't be easy. Ashley's world had left scars, debts to settle, bridges burned, trust broken. He knew the cost of reclaiming himself would be steep, but for the first time in months the path before him didn't look like a gilded cage. It looked like freedom, raw and unfinished. The days that followed were grueling. Marcus called vendors himself, not to salvage Ashley's dream, but to face the consequences. He admitted the truth, accepted blame, negotiated settlements. Some sneered, some threatened lawsuits, some simply hung up. Each call was a blow to his pride, but also a step toward redemption. James watched from the sidelines, offering guidance when asked, but never interfering. This was Marcus's burden to carry his test to pass. Ashley tried once more, showing up at the condo they had shared, her words dripping with venom disguised as regret. She spoke of misunderstandings, of opportunities wasted, of how they could still rebuild if Marcus just convinced his father to open the checkbook again. But Marcus didn't waver this time. He looked at her, really looked, and saw nothing but emptiness beneath the glitter. His words were calm, final. "I'd rather start from nothing than spend another day being someone else's pawn." Her mask cracked, then her fury erupting, but Marcus walked away without turning back. When he returned to his father's house that night, James was waiting on the porch, arms crossed, eyes steady. Marcus didn't speak at first. He simply stood there, the cold wind cutting through him, until James nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the man his son was becoming. Inside they sat again at the kitchen table, two men bound not by wealth or appearance, but by the unbreakable tether of blood and sacrifice. The victory wasn't sweet. It was bitter, tinged with the ashes of mistakes, debts, and humiliation. But beneath that bitterness was something stronger: relief. Marcus had lost much, but he had regained himself. He saw now that his father's life, built on sweat and loyalty, held more wealth than Ashley's family could ever purchase. James lifted his glass, not in celebration, but in quiet recognition. "Your mother would be proud you found your way back," he said, his voice low, rough with emotion he rarely showed. Marcus knotted his throat too tight to speak, but in his heart he knew it was true. The night stretched on, filled with silence that no longer felt heavy, but healing. Father and son sat together, not as strangers divided by illusion, but as men who had walked through betrayal and found their way back to truth. And though Marcus knew the road ahead would be long and costly, he also knew one thing with certainty: the foundation his parents had laid could not be bought, could not be erased, and would carry him forward stronger than any illusion ever could. Life often teaches its hardest lessons through betrayal, loss, and disappointment. Yet those same moments can sharpen our understanding of what truly matters. The story of James and Marcus reminds us that love, respect, and family cannot be purchased, no matter how dazzling the promises of wealth or prestige may seem. For older generations, this truth resonates deeply. We know that the strongest bonds are forged through sacrifice, loyalty, and shared struggle, not through appearances or luxury. The glitter of money fades, but integrity endures. When faced with choices that test our values, we must remember that standing firm in truth and dignity is worth more than any fleeting approval from people who will never truly accept us. Even when the cost feels high, reclaiming one's self is the greatest victory. For those of us who have lived long enough to see both triumph and heartache, this is a reminder that wisdom is our wealth, and it should never be traded away. If this message resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice and your life lessons may be the inspiration someone else needs today.